Hey, everybody, and welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about the cloud marketplace transformation activities. So, in this episode, I'm joined by Pam and Jacob, who are both going to give you a quick introduction in a moment. But this episode is intended to be for operations, finance, accounting, tax, legal, IT, deal desk, order management, and really anybody within the space who needs a better view under the covers, kind of an inside peek at what really happens when we need to take cloud go to market through a transformational effort. So, we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But while we do that, I want to welcome Pam and Jacob. Thank you both for being here. Can you give the audience just a quick overview of your experiences related to cloud go-to-market and just help them get a feel for your bona fide? So, Pam, if you don't mind, I'll let you go first.
Well, thanks, Patrick. Really great to be here. Just a bit of my experience. I led the hyperscaler operations at an enterprise software company. I spent the last 2 years working through the operational details to get on both the Google as well as AWS marketplace. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Pam. Jacob?
Thanks, Patrick. So my intro to cloud go-to-market was actually as the deal desk leader at a public enterprise software company, enterprise software and SaaS. And we were already on the marketplace, but it was very early for us, right? So we had set up some initial offers, and then I really got involved as we started to think about how we would scale and how we would actually bring that into our go-to-market strategy as a company. And over the last 3 to 4 years, I've transitioned out of that role, and I'm now leading our hyperscaler operations team as well.
Awesome. And no shortage of experience here. I know we've all sat through this role in one way, shape, or form. I got kind of an early look at it, and you and Pam have been the most recent to see how this really impacts your teams and your companies. And I think we've got a lot to talk about here today. So I'll kind of introduce everybody who's listening, why we're here, like how end user customers are driving this change. And so, for those of you that aren't aware and aren't following Jay McBain of Canalys, do so. He's got a ton of great insights that they put out, usually weekly, but quarterly at the least. And they recently validated that marketplace is growing at an 86% CAGR, and committed spend agreements made by most customers are continuing to go up and up and up. And so we see this trend continuing, and it's driving a lot of us into this space where we're kind of in reactive mode. And AWS is holding roughly 157 billion dollars, and companies have agreed to spend more on AWS services and third-party services through marketplace. So this is continuing to go up. Microsoft's at 117, Google at 72. Like, there's a lot. And even Roman. So for those of you that don't follow Roman Kirsanov, he's got his cloud go-to-market leader course. And Vince Mezzione also talked about, you've got to put in as much effort into selling to the hyperscalers as you do to your current market and your customers. And so this is truly, an all-out effort, a new go-to-market that everybody's got to buy into. And so today we're here to dive into kind of the most overlooked aspect. Everybody's always talking about co-sell and talking about offers and telling the numbers and deep diving into where we just talked about. But what they don't talk about is that this needs to be treated as its own channel. And, within that, there are a lot of different behaviors we need to think about. And so, Pam, I know you've had some good experience here. Can you, tell everybody a little bit about how you see and you saw existing customers transforming how they're procuring?
No, great. One of the things that had was clearly insights as to how customers were actually bringing us to the marketplace. So just as an example, the hyperscalers, as you stated, continue to grow, and it's an option for customers to procure, a company's solution through the marketplace. What I found was that the request really kind of started at the transactional level, where the customer, asked the account manager to use their hyperscaler spend. So some customers have been asking for this option for multiple years, and, they may wait for your company to have that option to acquire a solution. Or the, challenging part is they could move on to another vendor for that same solution if they were on the marketplace. The one thing that customers have found is the procurement process really kind of accelerates with the marketplace, which allows them to buy. The one thing I say is that, the customer in our digital online world only needs to review the documentation and click a button. So that truly supports the ease of doing business with a company. So those are kind of how I saw my experience with our customers.
Yeah, how about you, Jacob?
we saw some very similar customer demand, right? That's really what's driven us to start building around Marketplace. But one of the things that we're starting to see is as a company and as sellers, we really have the ability to start leveraging that momentum, right? Because we see customers out there who want it, and it's the ones that know their options that are starting to want it. We all have a lot of end users out there that their company may have significant AWS or Azure spend. That doesn't mean your individual buyer knows that. But you start prodding in the discovery phase around what's your company's cloud strategy? Who are you working with closely? And what is your procurement team doing with Marketplace? Is that something that you'd like to consider? As you start having more of those conversations, the doors start opening. And it's not something that we just have to kind of sit and wait for. But as we start building strategy around cloud go-to-market, there's lots of ways that you can spur sellers to be creating the opportunity to drive Marketplace as well.
Yeah, getting proactive in nature and not being so reactive, which I mean, honestly, that's where we all started, and a lot of companies have it that same way. But I remember, I was sitting at Dell in my cubicle working on transformational activities for ops, building out QBR decks, looking at our forecasts, trying to figure out where we had more opportunity. Sales came to me and was like, we got a problem. We've got customers asking to be on Marketplace. We don't know what to do. Like, can you go help us? And that unpacked this whole operational transformation that I wasn't ready for, that the company wasn't ready to support. And I didn't know how much I was going to take on. And I know you all felt a lot of these pains too. So, like, when we say operational transformation, we talk about getting ready, shifting this from being reactive to proactive. It means we have to be ready in a number of areas. So, if you've got multiple legal entities and need to transact and recognize revenue within each entity, that's a pain point that we need to go figure out. And that's not something the marketplace just hands you on a plate. It's like, this is how this works, and here's how you have to do it. That's like a couple week conversation and usually a tug of war with legal. Then you've got another example like handling tax and trade compliance across the globe. How you sell through marketplace is definitely going to impact that. So, like, where do they collect tax? What tax do they collect? What trade opportunities are there? Do they have programs to support this? When we actually go to send out invoices, a lot of our large enterprises were sending these automatically. Now we've got to go suppress them. So we're interjecting a lot of manual processes into this, I won't say well-oiled machine, because we all know our big machines were a little troubled, but we're injecting a lot of noise and difficulty into this process. So, booking, entitlements, disbursements, they all add layers of complexity. But Pam, and maybe you can help steer us, like, when somebody's thinking about this, and I've just overwhelmed them with a number of very fun topics. When somebody's thinking about this and they're thinking about, like, where do we start? Like, what's the biggest part of the transformation we need to think about? Where would you?
So one of the things that I found, and it was a key learning, was making sure that you had executive alignment at the very top. I mean, that was one thing that I particularly found, is that, though our executives, they hear about the hyperscalers and the opportunity to take advantage of new markets. But, as they get closer into it, they get a lot of concerns about multiple challenges. However, then you have the customers requesting the sales organization to transact using their spend or credit. And so what happens is if your executive team isn't in agreement, it becomes a bit incongruent. And that's kind of what I found. And so kind of one of my things is that make sure your executive alignment is kind of from the top down if the company is going to transact in the hyperscaler marketplace. Additionally, what I found is executives from all functions in the organizations have a view on opening up the hyperscaler marketplace. From the organization like tax and legal and accounting, finance, and even order services were actually, involved in this process. Most marketplace agreements are non-negotiable. So when you think about the legal side of it, that was a bit of a challenge. Again, back to the whole, just in general, executive leadership, hear that they want the new logo customers to come through the marketplace. But what really kind of happens is that you've got current customers that want to go through the marketplace. So kind of let me give you an example. What I found is that, the renewal, the company wants to be able to transact, or the customer wants to transact as a renewal, but the company is like, well, we have the renewal in the plan, and they want to go through the marketplace, and all they see is there's a fee being deducted. Current customers still want to use their credits to acquire the software, so sales continue to pursue the marketplace relationship. The other thing that kind of played out for me was from an ISV perspective is that, as a company, we had acquired capacity from the hyperscaler, and that you've also got the sales organization coming to the table from a go-to-market perspective and wanting to be able to obviously draw down consumption on our side. And sometimes we're not in alignment. So when I kind of step back, a company's business model has to be maybe in place for years, can be an opportunity for the company that is trying to align in the hyperscaler processes. What I found is that some companies do not have a worldwide account, as legal entities have been set up at the country level. So those were just a couple of the findings that I found. But back to the very beginning of this, you have to have upper level support to be able to really make this work with the marketplace.
Yeah, you got a lot. You said a lot there, a lot to unpack.
Mhm.
Good stuff. The executive teams having their own perceptions, right or wrong, of what the marketplace is or isn't, how those fees get deducted. Like those are definitely challenges that we want to prepare everybody for, that are going to happen, right? Your teams are going to know something about marketplace, right or wrong. And we need to make sure, one, you can level set, but two, you can get those buy-ins for those functions you mentioned, because there are agreements that you can't change. You do have a need to go get new logos, but that doesn't come right away, right? We've got to get this one-way street going before it starts to flow back in our direction. So good points, Pam. Jacob, when you think about this and when you hear what Pam talked about as far as executives are concerned, where do you see kind of a way for us to build a little bit of momentum there?
So I think especially coming from an established organization with existing channels, existing sales process, and back-end finance process, marketplace feels like an option at first, right? This is a new thing that we can do, and this one big customer in France is asking for it, right? So we need to go figure it out. It's easy with that perspective to get some of the pushback from different internal stakeholders, and it's natural, right? Why should your tax team want to go figure out how to do this in 17 different countries when the reality is each of the hyperscalers is going to mostly tell you it's your job to go figure it out, right? Why should we broach that problem? And there is a phase that I think a lot of companies, and I've seen this, and I know it's not unique, that you have to build some of that bottom up momentum. And from an operations perspective, that means a lot of bridging gaps, right? Because you have your seller out with a customer who wants to do this. Then you have your finance teams, like, how are we going to book this order? How's the revenue team going to know this order was placed and what's in it? How's the tax team going to know how to treat it in the context of all the systems and automations we have set up to manage an order in this country? But without some of those early wins, it can be really hard to convince an executive team that this is something we really should care about. We really should have really the whole of the organization dedicating significant time to remapping process and figuring out how this new channel works. But there are ways as operations that we can build that bottom up momentum, right? That may mean you're assembling kind of an offline order pack of all the details of a transaction. It may mean you're getting on the phone with your tax people and tax people at a and maybe local tax experts in a given jurisdiction, and digging through some of the details in a whole audience where none of those stakeholders know the full scope of how marketplace works. And none of us are going to become that tax expert either. But the bridge building that has to happen between the field and corporate and the hyperscalers and customers and other partners in the ecosystem, right? That's really where operations becomes critical to being able to help each side understand both the business impact and just how you get there, right? Because nothing is less productive than a sales team and a tax team trying to talk about how to do a transaction with no one else in the room, right? That's not going to get your company where you need to go.
Yeah, 100%. And I know we've all experienced this, and some folks that are listening to this are probably sitting there going, yeah, I had legal and tax yelling at me for a little while. We need to get on the same page. We can't just say this is something the company wants to do, get on board. That's not going to work. We need to show them the same level of investment that you're showing the sellers. That's like, this is the benefit for us. I know there's challenges here. Let's try to help you get through some of this. And if you're on legal, if you're in tax, like, just know that there are resources that can help you. And we had to go hire some. We hired Tackle, and then obviously I ended up there. There's tons of providers out there that can help walk through some of this. And as Jacob, you rightly pointed out, like, yeah, go get a tax expert and work through that. Don't just take the 400-page document that the cloud providers are sending you and say that that's all we need to know. We need to make sure we're audit proof because this is still new, right? All these things are very new from a maturity perspective. The marketplaces have been around for a few years, but like we're still seeing them evolve and change and react to feedback that ISVs are providing. So yeah, good call outs.
There's one other thing I'd add too, that from an operations perspective, thinking about this as if you're running a startup and you're looking for investors, right? Because you're asking everyone at the company to invest in what you're trying to build in cloud go to market.
Yeah.
And how would you demonstrate to an investor that you're worth investing in, right? It's what is the growth that you're showing? Market's great, right? The total addressable market and marketplace is huge. You alluded to that earlier. But what has our company done? What was a year ago? What's this quarter? What are we projecting and committing to for a year from now? And really thinking about it that way is a much more compelling thing to be able to present to your organization to get the momentum behind you.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. And we have to remember that the CSPs, these cloud providers, aren't generally spending a lot of time up front with us here in this partnership either. So like it's on all of us to figure out how we begin to build those relationships, bridge those gaps, take advantage of the resources that they do offer today, and know that as we grow and do more with them, sure, they'll provide us more resources and we can take some of that burden off. Good point. Okay, so today we know the cloud providers offer some help. It's very rare that you'll get the tax and legal people on the calls with your teams right away to go through everything. So we talked about, getting some outside help. They do offer some great new programs and there's some new things coming about. And I'd like to dive into some of those a little bit now and talk through maybe more of the legal challenges. And so Pam, I'll have you start. So I'll prep you here in a second. But I think what we want to look at is when I'm a company, whether I'm large or small, I've got a legal entity and it's in some country. How does that interface with how I'm going to sell through the marketplace? Because for AWS, for example, I've got to have a US bank account. And for Microsoft, we've got the notion of publishers. And for Google, they've got a new model coming out. And AWS has new things coming out. But it's this constant changing evolution, and each one's a little bit different. Can you talk to us, Pam, about like what are some of if I'm an ISV and I need to go sell in EMEA, for example, and I'm a US entity, maybe I've got some EMEA entities, what are some of the things I can do? And mainly, what are the challenges that you saw when you tried to set this up yourself for both AWS and Google? And what resources do the cloud providers have to help?
Really great points as to what needs to happen. I will kind of date back to what Jacob was saying. I learned more about tax than I ever wanted to learn in my entire life, honestly. Them and some special folk. But one of the things that I found is that, companies can have multiple entities and, they do that so that they can minimize tax impacts, the sales tax, the cross-country tax, and most hyperscalers, they're set up for their transacting process is a U.S. entity to the hyperscaler U.S. entity to an end user, and again, potentially aligning to the appropriate currency. Customers want to transact, how they want to pay. The hyperscaler pays the ISV in U.S. currency. And then the challenge becomes, like I shared earlier, is the setup of the company. What I found is, some companies don't have worldwide accounts. They have entity accounts. Money flows in all those respective places. And so one of the things I can share was that just kind of as a best practice is that when you're getting ready to set up your marketplace kind of early on, make sure you understand your company business model is set up. For an example, I think I had like 12, 13 entities I had to pay attention to, and all of them were very uniquely different. So one of the things that we did was that, let's get as an example, we started focusing only on those particular, like as a transaction, starting working by geo or country. The one thing that we did have the opportunity to do is that to hopefully minimize tax, specifically when going into Europe, is we actually had to join another type of program, which is Know Your Customer program, which is the KYC. part of AWS, that really kind of helped at least my tax individuals feel a little bit better about how that was to be transacted, that they felt like it was more to the entities in Europe, to an end user customer in Europe. And so the only thing I can share about the KYC process, again, you do have to ask all the right questions, but also understand that it does take time, because you do have to get a lot of, credential information from your organization. So most importantly, don't be trying to do this at the end of the quarter, because this is probably not going to work out for you. But anyway, those are kind of the key findings that I found as I continued to start moving outside the US, the tax, the legal, in the incremental programs that there were to offer.
Yeah, smart. I know my first deal was in Australia for AWS, and we went ahead and we would I feel so bad for our PDM at AWS. We're like, we need to set up an AWS Australia entity and an account. And they're like, we don't normally do this. You've already got a US account. And we're like, well, we need to set up 10 accounts. And they're like, no. So they let us do it, and then we came to regret that later, because that was obviously so yeah, getting involved in that process was something I did not know about, that we later came to kind of the realization that yes, we need to figure out how to work this internally. We're going to have some internal transfers. The quoting process for us was based on entity, so it really made it a challenge, but these are all part of the internal transformation activities that hopefully people are listening to and saying, I didn't even think about that. We need to start having that discussion. So thank you, Pam. Yeah, good call outs on AWS, especially looking at which countries do we transact the most in and prioritizing those for your tax assessments and so forth. So that's good. Jacob, I know you had some experience with both of these and Azure. And Azure, hopefully people will come to find out, for me at least, it was a little bit easier, but there's still a lot of work to be done there. Can you kind of talk through your experience with that and what that looks like?
Yeah, so I'd say a lot of what we've seen is like this is an ongoing process, right? So as we're continuing to sell in marketplace in most countries, and like many, right, a lot of our first transactions were in the US, Australia is another one, but this is starting to permeate out into other markets. And as you start getting into some specific jurisdictions, you find some very nuanced complications, right? So Brazil, right, Microsoft has a whole list that they can give you of all the countries in which they're making no representation about how they're going to work with tax. And
you said Brazil. Let's cover our ears. Don't say Brazil.
And you find out things like LARs and LSP partners that are involved in billing and invoicing for the cloud providers, but there's no clear map to that. And with Google recently, right, changing right, more like the other marketplaces, we're now having to go back and relook at some of these in specific countries where we've been transacting with end users for several years. So this is going to be a learning process that I think in the first rounds that we were doing this, it very much felt like we need to figure out how we're going to transact with AWS, how we're going to transact with Azure, and then we'll have figured it out. Because that's what you're used to, right? You set up an entity and then you know how to transact in that entity. The change management of this going forward is going to be an ongoing process. And that's something that I'm starting to think about, how you have, right, call like a business continuity plan for changes that any of these cloud providers might make, really with minimal ramp time, minimal runway, minimal documentation. And as marketplace is becoming material for a lot of us, right, how are you going to reckon with those changes and not have interruptions to the flow of business?
Smart and great call out. Like, it's one thing not knowing what's ahead and not knowing where to go and get started, and it's another to have figured that out, started running your business, and then realize, shoot, I'm now on 3 cloud providers or maybe more, and they're all changing regularly. So I got to stay on top of this, and having a shared resource to do it is very difficult, to say the least. Okay, so we talked a little bit about legal. So the fun part we'll kind of push back a little on. But I want to roll out a legal a little bit, talking through like EULAs and contracts, because they're a big part of where we came from an enterprise space, where we have to have contracts signed, we quote, and then we go to marketplace. We're not doing pay-go yet. We're not like click and buy in marketplace. We still have these kind of manual processes built in. And we're talking about like, we need to change the language within our EULA today so that it specifies something about marketplace. Within that, you've got terms that change, right? So we're not getting paid the same. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but Pam, you've had to work through some of these changes, especially internally when it comes to like your SKUs and such. But can you talk to us about, from a contracts and EULA perspective, what transformation activities you had to work through, and what are some best practices there?
So one of the things that we made a decision early on was to use private offer was the way that we transacted. So we didn't really have to change a lot on the EULA side of it, but it was really on the contracting to do, just the transaction in general. And one of the things that when we finally got to that place that really hadn't even considered was the fact that by the time that the order was getting in front of us, is that the SKUs that were selected related to different data centers. Because again, as I shared, we had a couple different hyperscalers. We had different products on those particular data centers, specifically as you were going outside the country. And one of the things that we had to get really clear up front was that by the time that order got here, it was usually with a SKU that actually was at the wrong data center. And so obviously you have to then run your way back up again. So what we did was to really overcome this was that, we had to really start early on to make sure that we didn't have the wrong SKUs, was getting all the parties working together on the transaction, which included our order services team, to be aware of, from a marketplace strategy, making sure you got the right SKUs on the right order with the right end user customer. And so that was certainly something that played out for us. Lastly, we also had to take the contract. Again, making sure from a legal and order services perspective is that on the order documents, we had to identify who the payee was and all the things that you would normally have in a contract. We had to make those changes. And again, it kind of came down to outside the US to include, what AWS's entity was. So we had to really start strategically working with teams to make sure that they understood that it just wasn't the way they used to do ordering in the past.
That's a good point. We didn't have to change a ton of the SKUs. Ours was mostly on the quoting tools. We had different quoting tools, and it just kind of made it a nightmare to figure out, well, which tool and which dollar affected which contract. But the SKUs piece is definitely something I've heard from a lot of ISVs since then. And Jacob, have you had to go through some of these same issues? What was your experience here?
We've certainly seen some similar challenges, and I know we're going to get into some of the bookings and rev rep conversations here in a little bit. Those ordering documents ultimately set the foundation for how you're going to process a transaction. But one of the other things that I'm thinking about and looking at as we start going into the next couple of years is both from a portfolio perspective and from a contracts perspective. I feel like a lot of us have been thinking about how kind of tweak or shift what we're doing to make the marketplace work, right? It's starting with private offers and making sure that we can facilitate in something that's kind of close to our comfort zone in all of these different aspects of the transaction. But as the momentum continues to build in the market, one of the things that I'm starting to think about is, are customers going to expect that to continue to evolve as well, right? With things like marketplace standard EULAs becoming more prevalent. And I know some startups are starting to adopt those as their main contracting vehicle, and private offers kind of giving way in some spaces into more utility, click to buy, consumption type offerings. Is, at what point is there going to be a pressure to start accepting things like that from the customer side as well? And right, knowing that we kind of were reactive in this, what I really consider like the first phase of marketplaces becoming a significant part of the enterprise go-to-market landscape. In that second phase, is the momentum going to build that customers are going to say, you know what, I actually only want to buy this product. It's not just good enough to be on marketplace anymore, but it needs to look like a cloud service if it's on marketplace. And it needs to fit into the standard EULA terms if it's on marketplace, because that's what procurement is starting to tell us. And how do we kind of get more ready for that shift than we were for this first kind of big growth in marketplaces? And I don't have an answer to that yet. And I don't think most established companies would have an answer to that yet. But I think there's going to be an opportunity in the market for the most cloud marketplace friendly companies, not just to be there, but to really take that next step for ease of procurement that will make a kind of differentiation in each of our spaces against competition.
Yeah, you've almost got three concurrent transformational processes flowing at the same time. You've got today, business as usual. We're still trying to figure things out. We're running deals through marketplace. Then you've got this other one which says, oh, there's all these new things that are coming out or have come out. I need to adopt to these processes and figure out how to do that. And so we've got these two kind of reactive pieces. And then you've got your third kind of proactive pillar of looking forward and saying, we can't keep doing this. How do we be better with the cloud providers? How do we start with product and then drive services and operations to mirror a simpler process so that we're not constantly having to go fight behind the scenes to say this changed, so I got to go back and get you to buy into something now and change this process and add these SKUs. So yeah, it's interesting. It's a lot of work, which is I know why the three of us wanted to have this conversation, at least from a high level today, and let everybody know that this is a very detailed and necessary piece of this your go to market, this transformational activity, and it should not be overlooked. So yeah, great points. All right, now I do want to talk about bookings and rev rec. So thank you, Jacob, for bringing that up. I think this is a perfect time to talk about that. For me personally, like this is why I started going and looking for other providers to help me because the marketplace at the time and even still today, they don't provide me enough data for the large enterprise to book a deal and take down everything I need from an audit perspective. So like we had to go out there and find a way to get like a virtual PO, a bookable artifact, and we needed that type of data. But when we look at this as an ISV, having the right amount of data to book a transaction is something most like overlook until you've started to create the private offer. And then you're like, oh shoot, I don't even have what I need to book the order through our systems. So thinking about that ahead of time is super critical. Like how do I now kick off entitlements? I've got the information and now I need to go kick off entitlements. What's that process look like? Can I do that process that does not trigger invoicing that could delay the delivery of this product? When I've got customer data, like what am I doing with that? How do I ensure I've got integrity of that data for the end user, the right amount of the deal value? Did we tax on the quote we sent out or did we remove tax? Do I have the right account? Do I have the right email? Do they have the right access? Do we know when we'll get paid? Like these are all things that we need to think about in the booking and rev rec process that are, huge challenges for a lot of ISVs to overcome initially. Both of you have gone through this and I've got to see a lot of the work you've done. And I know it wasn't easy at first, but Pam, I'll start with you again. Tell us a little bit about your experience with rev rec and bookings and what did that look like for you?
So kind of back to the original conversation of where you have to bring everybody together to have the conversation, honestly, because leaving one of them out is only going to be pure pain. So one of the things that we did, and again, remember, we did the private offer. So bringing all the stakeholders together, the accounting, the order services, the rev rec and everything is that we validated what we needed as a complete booking. And so that was an early decision. And so how we transacted with the private offer is that we made sure that all the paperwork was completed, all signatures, everything was signed, ready to deliver in a normal process. That's when we then sent it through the marketplace to the hyperscaler, to the end user customer. One of the things that, as I had shared earlier, is, we had to update a few areas on the order, like, the payee. But when the end user customer pushed the button, and again, we actually utilized Tackle, which allowed us to have a document sent back to our order services. That exactly when they received that is what allowed us to choose accepting the order. And so again, I think that based on that, which allowed the order to be processed, was key. Again, early on, bringing everybody to the table, making sure that we had, for us, the paperwork was all signed up front and was agreed upon. And it was just really the process of sending it through the tool, accepting it. And that's what gave us a processed order.
Smart. So you went with the easiest and fastest route of a large enterprise. Like, let's just do all the work we're doing today outside the marketplace. Let's get all the paperwork we need done. And then let's find a way to get that information back. And you mentioned you use Tackle for that. Let's find a way to get that back and let's do that. And then I imagine, we talked about those other two pillars. Now the company's probably looking at what are the ways we can start to change to automate that a little bit more. Are there internal ops we can do there? So that's great. Good job, Pam. Jacob, I know you saw something similar here, and you all are taking a similar, but maybe a little bit of a different approach. How can you tell us a little bit about what that looked like for you?
Yeah, I think it's a similar challenge. One of the big kind of fundamental decisions that you have to make around this is what outside of marketplace documentation do you want to have about an order, or do you think you need to have about an order? And you're going to need something from marketplace, whether you get it from a third party like Tackle, or whether you're compiling things internally, or you build a homegrown tool that compiles some of that marketplace data internally to show like a quote unquote virtual PO, bookable artifact, whatever term you want to use for it. But what do you need on top of that is something that I've seen different approaches to. And the simplest answer, if you can get there, is nothing, right? If you can have your terms accepted in marketplace, which the marketplaces do facilitate, right? You can upload your EULA, whatever that says, right? If you can get there and you don't need an order form towards that ease of procurement marketplaces can give, because is that final kind of checkbox at the end of an order. All the negotiation should be done, right? You shouldn't be putting 7 different versions of pricing into marketplace to review and go back and forth on. But if you can get to the point for the customer that the only thing they're executing on is that check in the box in marketplace, that's where, for me at least, it really starts feeling more like an online transaction and less like kind of the last final extension of a traditional B2B sales process. And I don't think every company is going to be able to get there, but for someone who's kind of at the first or second phase of this journey right now, thinking about what you want the customer experience to be when you're done feels like a very important thing to ground to. And I don't think there's a right answer, but I lean towards making everything as easy as we can.
Yeah, super smart. I think looking at it through the customer's lens is something we all could use a reminder on, because even during this discussion, it's like, I've got all these problems, I need to change how we're doing things, I need to do this modification, and we tend to lose sight of, like, how does this look for our customers? How can we make it easier for them? They're wanting to procure this way more and more. They're wanting to make this process simpler as well. How do we help make that easier? And keeping everything offline in the marketplace is only going to work for so long. Like, we need to start adopting some of those EULAs, or we need to start changing how we run our processes internally so that it looks cleaner to them, even if it's still a bit of a pain in our rears on our side. But
the one thing we haven't gotten into on this conversation, and it warrants a whole conversation of its own, but coming out of a traditionally channel-led business as well, right? Getting into the differences between a CPPO or an MPO order in marketplace and a channel transaction is a whole different set of conversations about paperwork and who's your customer and who's being billed by whom and what is the partner's role. And all of those topics, if you are in a position where you're kind of dealing with an existing channel as well, it adds a whole nother layer that you have to reckon with in all of these operational changes.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good transition, Jacob. I think this conversation today, we all kind of discussed, we wanted to just keep it high level and really cover some of the key topics from a 50,000 foot view on, if you're going into this space, if you're going to go take advantage of everything that the marketplaces have to offer. Like, we are definitely on board with that, and I think we encourage it, but we want to make sure people are aware, especially those in operations and maybe those who are still working on getting buy-in across their teams, that this is a process that's going to take the entire quote to cash team, everybody involved in that cycle, to change something about what they're doing today. And they're going to have some sort of impact, and you should be ready for it. And hopefully we allowed everybody to get a little bit of a takeaway there. And so wrapping it up, Jacob, Pam, I'd like you each to just give me some of your high level takeaways as to, hey, maybe I didn't listen to the 30 minutes. And I just want you to give me the last 2 minutes of, like, what are the key things that I should be aware of as a person within the ISV team, whether it's ops or alliances or finance or tax. Like, what are some of the things that I should be aware of going into this from a transformational perspective?
So from my perspective is that, again, the customer is going to drive the desire to buy through the marketplace. I mean, that's kind of number one. Most transactions with your current customers is not going to be a new logo. It's going to be your current customers that are going to want to buy from the marketplace. The other thing that I kind of brought up at the very beginning is to identify your stakeholders. understand your business, the tax, the legal entities, and explore the hyperscaler, getting the best practices to solve your business model. The other thing, and we kind of called it out, is to get outside support. And that specifically came up from the tax side of it, is that get a third party to kind of give you some feedback. But most importantly, what I found is that, tax people like to talk to other tax people. And that was kind of key to my journey. And then last but not least, prepare yourself, because this is going to be an incredible ride as you're satisfying your customers' needs through the marketplace, is kind of what I found through my journey.
Yeah, that's great. I think one of those that I loved, Pam, is like, go on LinkedIn and look at a company who you know is on Marketplace, if you're a tax person or a legal person, and go find that resource who's in your role and ask them if they'd be willing to chat with you for a little bit. Like, I found that the folks in these operational or internal communities will really like to share their experience. And yeah, good point. Don't be afraid to ask for help.
So I couldn't agree more. And that's something that we've leveraged a few times in this journey. And I would agree that in this cloud go-to-market community, right, there's a lot of us focusing on the same things in our own pockets. And we wouldn't be on this call right now if we weren't happy to chat about it when the opportunity comes up. The other thing that I would add is really think about the phase that your company's in with cloud go-to-market and what that phase requires. If the goal is to get your first 10 transactions, don't go figure out how you do tax in every country in the world. Figure out how you get those 10 transactions and what do you need your revenue team to have to be able to get those first 10 transactions. That's your building point to say, now we need to start talking about how we make this 100 transactions and what does that scale look like. And as you start getting into the hundreds of transactions, the other challenges will come and you'll have to start figuring out how you address them. But I don't think you can do this out of order unless you have a company make a very marked shift that this is the new priority, full stop. You're going to reckon with people in other departments who don't fully understand it, or executives who aren't fully aligned with what you're doing. And you're going to need to build on why they should. So take each phase as it comes, get the help where you need the help, but maintain that eye towards where you think this should be in 2, 3, 4 years. Because if you don't build in a direction, you just end up kind of in this perpetual operational scramble of getting deals done. And there is a breaking point at which you can't look at every order, right? You can't have the same 2 people do every order. And you want to have the plan before you get to that point on how you're going to drive automation, consistency, process, enablement, all of those pieces that come with it.
I love it. So start where your customers are. Think about this transformational activity from the customer's perspective as well. So what do we need to do first? Start easy. So where are the areas that I think we can focus on right now? Don't get crazy. As you just mentioned, Jacob, we don't need to go solve everything, but we need to start planning long-term and look at the best practices that align to our business model, our entities and taxes that we want to grow to, and then get some help. I think those are probably my key takeaways from everything we talked about today. If you didn't listen to the rest, like those are the simplified versions, but I think it would be great for us to dive deeper into some of these topics. And so if anybody listening is interested and has any of those topics particularly in mind that they'd like us to talk through, I know we're going to probably have a few more of these conversations and we'll dive deeper into each one. Pam, Jacob, this was awesome. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me today. Is there anything else you want the audience to know about what you're doing, or where they can find more information or contact you if they need some help?
From my perspective, certainly contact me. Also, to Patrick, what you said about LinkedIn, that's one of the things I did. I went and I searched for other people that were doing the same thing. Everybody wants to help because everybody's kind of in the same situation. So that would be kind of my recommendation kind of in closing.
Second awesome. That as well. Happy to have a conversation with anyone who's kind of looking through some of these challenges on their side.
Well, there you have it. If you got nothing else, you've got 3 resources who I didn't say how much they cost. Are you guys free or do you cost a lot of money? Mine will probably come with a tag. I think Pam and Jacob would be more gracious. But no, thank you everybody for listening to today's episode on operational transformation for cloud go-to-market. And I hope you have a great day.